Welcome to Books and Bridges, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are a humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We explore the wisdoms of the world and apply them to modern life. As part of our discussion series on the great ethical schools of thought, tonight we delve into the questions that human beings have always asked and always will ask. How do we know right and wrong? What obligates us to treat other human beings with respect? Is the moral sense a gift from God or an instinct embedded in our nature? Separated by 500 years, Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant and medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas elevate the role of reason in deciding these thorny questions. And our guide through the thicket will be James Carey. Dr. Carey has taught liberal arts and classics at St. John's College since 1979, in both Annapolis and Santa Fe, serving 2 terms as dean and 1 year as acting president. He received his BA from the University of North Carolina and his MA and PhD from the New School for Social Research. Dr. Carey has also held the position of Distinguished Visiting Professor at the United States Air Force Academy. His published work focuses on ancient and medieval philosophy, the latest book of which is titled Natural Reason and Natural Law, an assessment of the Straussian criticisms of Thomas Aquinas. So Dr. Carey, I turn the time over to you. We will listen to your presentation and then we can engage in a back and forth question and answer session. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here, Nathan. This is a real honor. So my topic is rational morality. Morality has to do with conduct. Probably doesn't need much of an explanation. Alas, the word rational does, partly because the contemporary conception of reason is somewhat different from its classical conception. Typically, we think today of reason as a kind of calculator, a computer that you have inside your head, and if you want to apply it to action, you have these desires and you use your reason to calculate how to satisfy them. We can call that the instrumental use of reason. And it's sometimes tied together with the notion that it's somewhat bound by societal preferences. Sometimes it's understood to be limited by or supplemented decisively by divine commands. The classical view of the matter, as one finds it in these 2 different thinkers, they're quite different in many respects, Thomas Aquinas and Kant, really relies on an older conception of reason, and that is that reason is not simply instrumental. It can be used that way, but it has ends of its own. Reason is teleological in the sense that it aims. And the aiming of reason takes place in 2 distinct spheres. One of these is the sphere of thinking and trying to understand things. The other is in the sphere of deliberation and action. The former we understand to be the sphere of speculative reason, the latter the sphere of practical reason. Now, they're not 2 different reasons for us humans. It's one and the same reason, but with 2 different employments. Reason, though, has a certain feature that's distinctive about it, and that is that it's governed by a principle of consistency. So if someone thinks inconsistently, we can be pretty sure he's thinking unclearly and making some mistakes. If he says one thing and then contradicts himself a little bit later on, we catch him on it and we'll say, well, you say this now, but a few minutes ago you said such and such. And if he said, yeah, that's right, I think both those things are true. I think 2 plus 2 exactly equals 4, and actually I think it equals 17 too. We'd say, have you lost your mind? It's hard for us to believe that a person would make a frank contradiction, and it rarely happens except to make a point, as I was just doing, or when one slips up. Thomas Aquinas, and we'll start with him since he's the earlier thinker, understands speculative reason to be governed by certain principles. And these principles are the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of excluded middle, one might say the principle of identity. I just indicated how this works. If a person contradicts himself, trying to understand how things are structured or ordered, we sense that he's not thinking clearly. But Thomas Aquinas also argues that in the sphere of practical reason, there are comparable principles. And that's really quite remarkable. He doesn't simply follow Plato and Aristotle on this matter, but he builds on something that Aristotle says. And I'll briefly sketch the principles of practical reason as Thomas Aquinas understands them. The central claim, or the beginning claim of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, some of you have read it and familiar with it, is that every desire, project, aim, working, aims at some end, and therefore seems to aim at some end, therefore the good has rightly been declared that at which all things aim. Now, Aristotle realizes, and Thomas Aquinas as well, that people often do bad things. That's clear. But whatever they do because they think it is in some respect good. So our action is actually purposive. Purposive is what I meant by the word teleological. It aims. If I pick up my watch and look at it, I'm aiming at something, finding out what time it is, how much time I have left in my presentation. If I adjust my position in the chair, I'm aiming at greater comfort. Almost everything we do, in fact, I'd go so far as to say everything we do that is not an accident, we do is by way of aiming at something at some purpose, and that purpose strikes us as good. Maybe not good in all respects, but good in some respect. Otherwise, we would not be able to do it. So what Thomas Aquinas does is take this description of the good as what's intrinsically desirable and turns it into a formulation that's not quite command, as commands are usually understood, but has something of a prescriptive or directive character. And he calls this the first principle of practical reason. And many people have written about its intriguing formulation. It's in a gerundive, and it is good is to be done and pursued, and evil avoided. So that's a move beyond Aristotle. Aristotle comes close in certain formulations to this gerundive structure, but it's the first principle of practical reason. Two things about it we need to know. One, in saying good is to be done and pursued and evil avoided, it's a principle of reason. It's a principle of reason applied to action. Furthermore, it's utterly formal. There's no real content to it. Sure, it sounds good. The good is to be done and pursued and evil. What about the goods? Pleasure seems to be a good. Duty seems to be a good. Sharing your thoughts with friends, that seems to be a good. So what does it mean to say good is to be done and pursued and evil avoided if it's an empty, purely formal principle by itself? So that's one thing we know. We'll see how it is that Thomas Aquinas fleshes out his understanding of the principles of moral action, though building on the first principle of practical reason. The second thing we note about it is it's not an obligating precept. That is to say, it actually necessitates us. We cannot act without that principle motivating us to act. Even the murderer commits the murder because he thinks that doing so is think he's wrong. You probably think it's in every respect bad, but he thinks it's in some respect good. Let's say in the worst case, merely how he gets. He thinks that feeling is good. He's mistaken. He didn't think it was good. If he thought it was bad in every respect, he didn't do it. So when people act, they do so with some thought put on their minds. Thomas Aquinas, then, having articulated this initial principle, the first principle of practical reason, turns his attention to something about us human beings that's rather distinctive. And that is that we have inclination, tendencies, desires, appetites, one might say. Some of these inclinations we share, according to Thomas Aquinas, with irrational beings, like namely the inclination to preserve ourselves. And therefore, our physicist friends tell us that that happens in nature as well. If you push a stone, it resists being pushed. You push against the wall, they even tell us the wall pushes back. Things resist being moved out of the position they're in, and they particularly resist destruction. So, according to Thomas Aquinas, this inclination to preserve oneself pertains to the natural law. We'll see how in a few minutes, maybe. The other, he goes a little bit higher because the inclinations we have are hierarchical. Above this is the inclination we share with higher beings, with animals in particular. And among these are the inclination to reproduce and the inclination to take care of our offspring and train them in the things they need. Finally, he argues there are inclinations that we have according to our rational nature. We have an inclination, Thomas Aquinas says, to know the truth about God. And we have an inclination according to our rational nature to live in society. I'll take the second one I mentioned first, because it doesn't mean just to be with others, but it means to share things with others, living in society. It means to form friendship, to form laws, among other things, to help each other with our mutual endeavors, to have conversations like this. These things are possible, according to Thomas Aquinas, and here he follows Plato and Aristotle, only in society. And only in society is there leisure for such a thing, to say nothing of books, which facilitate these conversations. So living in society is not just living in a herd. Living in society means living in a specifically human order of things. But the first inclination I mentioned, the first that he mentions is the inclination to know the truth about God. He is a very careful thinker, Thomas Aquinas, and he's a very careful writer. He doesn't say, though he could have said, the inclination to know God. That's not, according to Thomas Aquinas, self-evidently a natural inclination. It's not self-evident that God even exists, but it's self-evident, he thinks, that we are inclined, we're naturally inclined to want to know the truth about God, whatever it is. If there's a God, we want to know that. If there's not a God, we want to know that too. It is our rational nature to want to know the truth about God, whatever it is. Obviously, some people have an axe to grind on these matters, and that's unfortunate because they don't discuss things clearly. But Thomas Aquinas thinks that a thoughtful atheist, a thoughtful theist, though they disagree in the answer they give to the question, is there a God, a first principle of the whole, they nonetheless realize it's an important question. So we want to know what the truth about God is. Okay, from these two inclinations, to know the truth about God and to know, and to live in society, in conjunction with the first principle of practical reason, we take those two together and we get properly obligatory, obligating precepts of natural law. The first of which is to avoid ignorance. Big surprise to some people. Thomas Aquinas would say, you are obligated to avoid ignorance, and you're obligated to avoid offending others. And by an offense, Thomas Aquinas means harming someone else without provocation or out of proportion to prior harm received. He means doing what we would call, and he would call it as well, an injustice to others. The reason for that is you cannot live in society. I'm not talking about being parasitical in society as a criminal might be, but you cannot live a human life in society if you offend others. And similarly, you can't know the truth about God if you don't avoid ignorance. Now, Thomas Aquinas in that latter one is actually the first of the two that he mentions, but in the natural law precept to avoid ignorance, he states that really as a duty of what one could call, and what Kant does call, a duty of wide latitude. You get to sort of pick and choose the things that you're going to study that you think will help you understand the nature of the universe and its first principle if it has one, its first principles if it has several, its essential constitution if it doesn't have a cause, and its cause if it does have a cause. There are various studies you can pursue that enhance your understanding of the world and enable you to move towards, maybe just make a few steps, but nonetheless towards, as a rational being, knowing the truth about God. So Thomas Aquinas presents these two precepts as obligating. And by obligating, I mean three things. This characterizes our use of the word ought almost invariably, and I think invariably when it applies to action. Maybe some locutions where this doesn't happen. But in saying that I ought to do X, I mean several things. One, that it is good to do X in some sense. Two, that I can do X. And so as the analytic folks like to say, ought implies can. But what they don't say with sufficient frequency, in my opinion, is the third feature of the ought or obligation, and I think it's decisive, and that is ought implies might not. Doesn't imply will not, but it implies might not. Even when I'm not speaking of moral matters, if I say I ought to mow the grass this weekend, I'm implying it's good to do it, and that I can do it. I can't, if I couldn't mow the grass, I wouldn't say I ought to mow the grass, but also that I might not. It's up in the air. And when I look into the past, I say something similar. Let's see, I just took a long car ride. I might say I ought to have gotten gas at that last interstate exit. I mean, that means that it would have been good to do. I could have done it, and I might not do it. In fact, in that case, I didn't do it, but I'm speaking in terms of possibilities. This, by the way, implies that our use of the language ought has freedom as a presupposition, freedom of choice. We say such and such ought to be the case, we imply, but might not be the case. We are saying that the sphere of the possible is wider than the sphere of the actual. That's the case in our actions only if we've got free choices. So this is not an ironclad argument for freedom of choice. It is a very strong argument, I think, for the claim that we believe when we act that we have free choice. By the way, this happens in deliberation as well. Should I do this or should I do that? Should I study for this test that's coming up tonight? Can I put it off to tomorrow? What I'd really like to do tonight is go to the gym. Which one should I do? We deliberate, and we deliberate as though the future had these live possibilities in front of it. So once again, I myself don't think it can be proven that we humans have free will. I think it's manifest that we think we have free will when we are deliberating and in most of everyday life. When we get in a classroom and try to argue that, in fact, we don't have free will, then our classroom position is a little bit different from the position we have in daily life. In fact, I would say determinism, the view that we don't have free will, is a principle of, is a theory of action we can't really act on. So it's kind of a strong claim, but I'm willing to make that. Let me shift now to Kant. So we've identified two precepts of natural law. These are primary precepts. Thomas Aquinas says there's some secondary precepts. Kant speaks not of the precepts of natural law, but of the categorical imperative, sometimes the moral law. And there are similarities with Thomas Aquinas, but Kant's point of departure is a little bit different. We can consider that a little bit later on in the question period. I want to go straight to the version of the categorical imperative. I think it's the second, that's sometimes called the end in itself formulation. Kant thinks that there's a fundamental difference between persons and things. And that difference for him is the difference between something that is an end in itself, has intrinsic worth, and something which has its worth in its use by someone else. Kant makes a very strong claim next, and that is that a rational being, and that would be you and me, all of us, a rational being is incapable of thinking of himself or herself as a mere instrument to be used by others. That is, we know, each of us individually, that we have some worth. Even if a person says, well, I'm going to make myself an instrument of God's mercy and God's love, that's fine. Kant has no argument against that. But even then, the rational being understands himself or herself to be consenting to be an instrument of God's mercy, of God's love. It'd be very strange to say, I consent to being used by others without my consent. Kant thinks you can't do that. If you say those words, you don't know what you're saying. So that means that we understand ourselves to be ends that are not to be used as mere things by others. Sometimes we have to use each other as things. If I need to get to the airport and there's a taxi driver, I treat him as a means to get there. He's the driver of the car and I don't have one. But I don't treat him as a mere means because I pay him what we've agreed upon. I don't jump out of the taxi and try to run away if I were able to do such a thing. I don't cheat him. I try not to cheat him. And that's because I realize that he too has worth. And if he gives me, says, oh, here's your change for $4, and I realize that one of these dollars is a $20 bill, I could sneak off with it, but that wouldn't really be treating that person as an end. Now, this is very important for Kant. if I treat one thing as something that it's not, let's take a bizarre example. If I treat the carburetor of an automobile as a washing machine and stuff cloth in it to wash it, everyone would say that's insane. You're not going to wash your cloth that way. Oh, okay. And someone says, well, I'm going to treat a pencil as a pair of pliers. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, I agree. But at least in those two cases, I was treating one thing as another thing. If I treat Nathan Nielsen as a thing, not as a person, that's a much graver error. That's a much graver error, because I'm not treating any longer a thing as a thing. I'm treating a person as a thing. That's what's so abominable about slavery. It's the treatment of persons as things. And Kant thinks, and this is very important for understanding whether reason has a rational basis, Kant thinks that I cannot give a reason why you should refrain from treating me as a mere thing without seeing right away that any reason I could give for why you shouldn't treat me as a mere thing, a doormat, is a reason why I shouldn't treat you as a doormat. What is it in me that enables me to say, how dare you treat me like a mere thing, and yet to continue to treat you like a mere thing, or to set out to do so? It makes no sense at all. So Kant would say that injustice has this character in general of treating others as mere means. In fact, typically, we've been talking about this in the question period, typically when you do something unjust, you count on others not doing unjust things so you can get away with your little injustices. It may not be so little. So we can say the injustice is parasitical on justice. It wouldn't work unless most people were just, or at least enough of them for the injustices to be cleverly designed and carried out. So that's a bit of a sketch of two men's thoughts of principles of morality. Now, Thomas Aquinas, as some of you know, is a Roman Catholic saint, and he thinks there's a God, and he has a lot to say about that. And he thinks that, as a matter of fact, there are certain divine commands that we get that complement what we find through natural law. Natural law pertains to our nature as rational beings. It comes out of our reason, and we can make a case for it, as I've tried to do in this all too brief presentation. The commands of revealed law have a different character altogether. Kant is somewhat skeptical about commands, more so than Thomas Aquinas, to put it mildly, about revelation, commands of God to Moses, Paul, what have you. But both thinkers agree that our reason in its practical employment proceeds by means of principles, and their identification of these principles, even if their route to them is remarkably similar. Maybe I'll leave it at that and see what questions we might have, but what observations you might have.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jim. That's a wonderful groundwork on which to pursue further and ask further questions. I open it up to you as well to ask questions and submit them to the Q&A button. Let me start with my own question, if you don't mind. It seems to me that moral deliberation is similar to navigating some kind of a murky wilderness in which we only see partially, and we only have partial tools with which to make a decision. And so we may have at our disposal our reason, we may have our senses, we may have some kind of a moral instinct, we may have inherited knowledge or memory that we have to use to kind of make sense of what options present themselves to us. Would Thomas Aquinas say that successful moral deliberation requires a kind of combined usage of all those elements? Or is...
Yes, he does. And yes, because he thinks that we have to, in adjudicating difficult moral situations, we have to employ judgment and prudence, both. And these are virtues of the intellect. And as a matter of fact, people we know disagree about some things. They don't tend to disagree about others. Most people would agree that murder is wrong. If we come to a controversial matter like abortion, then the question is, well, is the newly fertilized ovum a person, or is it a thing, or is that distinction between person and thing break down there? Does it have, do we have moral obligations to it? Can you have moral obligation to something that formed in so elementary a fashion? The interesting thing is that when we talk about a controversial subject like abortion, where judgment and prudence are required, judgment in particular, I would say, we don't just say, well, I'm in favor of abortion and you're opposed to it. Just who we are. You don't like it, and I kind of like it. I think it's a pretty good thing, but you don't. But I don't have any reasons why I think it's good. It's just who I am. You're just who you are. No, we argue. And by arguing, I mean speak in the best possible sense. We give reasons. That's what I mean by arguing. We give reasons for what we think. I'm speaking hypothetically. You say abortion is wrong for these reasons. Jim, don't you see such and such? And if I supported abortion, I don't. But if I did, I'd say, yes, but you have to realize so and so, what we found out about problems for the mother. We have a conversation about it. That by itself proves that we think that reason has something to say about moral matters. Or if we talk about the definite, and you think it's wrong, and you try to say why it's wrong, and I think it's actually justified, and I try to say why I think it's justified, and then you think I can't both say that and be opposed to abortion. We have a conversation, and we try to keep it civil, and we try to be rational. But that means that whenever we have such a conversation, we think reason has something to say about this. We don't just leave it at, well, society says abortion is all right, so I guess it must be. I've never heard anyone say that ever. Now, sometimes people say God says it's wrong. Obviously, that's a more complicated matter. But generally, even people who say God forbids it complement that claim with reasons. That's human life, and so forth. So deliberation and prudence are complicated. We might find some cases where Kant and Thomas Aquinas might disagree. But when I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, always the first thing we looked at was a difficult moral question. It was discovered that during World War II, the Allies found out that extraordinary number of Jews were being executed on a regular basis at Auschwitz. And the question became, should we bomb Auschwitz? We didn't have precision bombing then. It was clear many Jews would be killed if we did. That might keep a lot more from being killed later on. Will that mean you're using those who are there as mere means and the others as ends? We have to deliberate about these things. But most of the time, and I really mean about 99%, it's pretty clear you shouldn't steal money from that person sitting next to you, or that you shouldn't murder that person because you envy their good luck. We don't need to do a lot of deliberating about those. Some people, by the way, do steal, and some people do murder. But those, I think, are pretty easy cases.
Yeah, one thing that's striking about Kant is that he has this really stark view of human reason as something that everyone is endowed with, and that it kind of, in that way, it unites human beings, puts them on the same plane. If we all have human reason, if we all have the same tools to deliberate, why is there such stark, just divergent moral codes and ethics and moral conclusions around the world in different cultures and nations?
Well, that's a very good question. And I would say, make a couple of observations that might be helpful. One is that in the sphere of action, when you're trying to determine what you ought to do, though you can be inconsistent while insisting that others treat you as an end, treating them as mere means, you can be inconsistent there. The inconsistency isn't so glaring when we're talking about what ought to be the case as it is when you're talking about what is the case in engaging in speculative reasoning. So if a scientific theory ends up containing a contradiction, the scientists say, well, we've got to go back to the drawing board. So it's harder to detect in some respects because of the particularity of situations, how a universal principle applies to it. So to use just examples I mentioned, abortion and the death penalty, are they instances of murder? Or is one an instance of murder and the other isn't? Or neither one of them is. So that's one feature that has to be considered. But again, we reason about these things. The other is that that I think the differences between cultures is somewhat exaggerated. Right. I mean, we know that that certain obligations of marital fidelity in some tribes may not be as adhered to with as much rigor as one would see in others. But actually, there are a lot of points that are in agreement. For instance, my guess is that when someone, I could be wrong, but when someone in a tribe that's not highly civilized and refined gives an oath, it maybe matters more to that person than it does to us. We make promises that we don't keep with some frequency. We make marriage vows that we don't keep. That's not so nice. So I'm not sure how different we are, but Thomas Aquinas has had the impression that most human beings know the fundamental precepts, that we call them the primary precepts of natural law, and can be brought to see them in the course of a conversation. And by the way, these people in primitive, shall we say, societies, they have certain principles of justice they act according to. They can be very loyal. They have a notion of oaths, and they too speculate about the divine. They're not indifferent to it. They want to know what there is to know about these things. So I think the differences between societies can be exaggerated. Now, within a society, in a presently civilized society, you still have people committing murder, rape, theft, bearing false witness against their neighbors. That's terrible. And how can they do it? And I think the answer to that is through self-deception. Thomas Aquinas says at one place, there's nothing about which we cannot choose not to think. When I want something really badly that I think maybe I shouldn't have because it doesn't belong to me, I'm able to convince myself that, well, I really have these passions and I can't act otherwise. And then I stop thinking about my obligations. I think Thomas Aquinas is of the opinion that you can suspend your moral reason. It's a terrible thing. Self-deception, one might describe briefly as one of the most stupendous and simply the most hideous of the abuses of freedom. I can deceive not just you by telling you a lie. I seem to be able to deceive myself. How such a thing is even possible.
So reason seems to be fairly slippery. We can use it to fit our own agendas, so to speak, right?
Yeah,
it needs to be guided by something else, it seems.
Well, it depends on what's going on. For Thomas Aquinas, what you need is a good will, and that sounds like Kant. But there's a passage where he says a good will makes a man good simply. So there has to be a right appreciation of the end at which we're aiming, and our wills have to be good as well. This is, I think, a great difference between Thomas Aquinas and Socrates. Maybe Aristotle as well, though I'm not so sure on this. But Socrates speaks as though whatever appears to us to be best is what we do as a matter of necessity. Thomas Aquinas would say, well, we have goods of our rational nature and we have goods of our animal nature. And our reason tells us to prefer the goods of reason to the goods of our animal nature when you can't have both. In fact, we could define Thomas Aquinas's or articulate Thomas Aquinas's implicit definition of obligation as the effect of the command of reason in the presence of two or more goods, not all of which can be chosen. But you're quite right. The will is able to say, don't think about your obligations. It's going to get in the way of having fun or getting something that you really want that doesn't belong to you. And lo and behold, we're able to deceive ourselves into doing that. And that's what makes us bad. I think that for Thomas Aquinas and Kant, that kind of willful self-deception is a far more serious problem in human moral relations than not being altogether clear about what to do in a difficult situation. The grave problem is not in the intellect exclusively. it's at least as much, if not more so, in the will.
We have a question from Carl Scott, who is actually a St. John's College graduate. He says, could you tell us more about your book? What are the main position and thinkers you're defending Thomas Aquinas from?
Well, my book is a response to Straussian criticisms. Some of you know Strauss is, and I don't want to bore you by telling you things you already know. But Leo Strauss was a very, very impressive political scientist. I'd say a political philosopher. He doesn't use the word philosopher himself, but I would call him a political philosopher. And he wrote extensively on the history of political philosophy, and he wrote somewhat on Thomas Aquinas and Kant, though not a lot on either one of them. And they had certain, Strauss had certain criticisms. He seems to have thought that Thomas Aquinas marked a kind of descent from the heights of moral thinking that were scaled and achieved by Plato and Aristotle. I just gave an example that thought all choice is determined by the apparent good. So there are other, I could list some of them, but there are other criticisms of Thomas Aquinas that his moral teaching depends upon a natural theology. I think that's not the case. I said very little about God in the presentation, right? That his moral principles depend upon they depend upon revelation. I don't think that's true for Thomas Aquinas. His moral principles depend upon a notion of nature, natural law, that's been called into question by modern natural science. I don't think that's true either. Just to name a few points on which Strauss and his students criticized Thomas Aquinas.
So what is the role of revealed, what is the role of revealed religion, religious teachings, scripture in the moral deliberation?
Yeah, well, first, one thing I'll say that might be surprising. Thomas Aquinas says that the moral precepts of the Decalogue, the second half of these you described, pertain to natural law. So he would say, we all know that we ought not to commit adultery. We don't need God to tell us that. Oh, excuse me, that's not the way of putting it. We might need God to tell us that, but if that's so, that's just because of how indurated our self-deception has become. It's hard and difficult to eradicate, maybe difficult to recognize. Do we really need God to tell us that you should not destroy innocent life, the life of a young person who's never done anything wrong? We want to kill that person? So Thomas Aquinas thinks that the giving of the moral precepts of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, really endows those precepts with a majesty that they might not have. It's one thing to say, well, my reason tells me not to murder, but I'm going to ignore my reason. When you think that God himself is telling you not to murder, then you might think twice when you otherwise wouldn't. But the other features of the Ten Commandments, like the Sabbath in particular, for Thomas Aquinas, that's a revealed teaching. So keeping the Sabbath holy, one might say that, well, you probably should keep one day of one day periodically should be set aside for leisure, so you can get some rest and so forth. But that you keep a day holy, that had to be revealed. I would go further and say the prohibition against coveting had to be revealed. One could say, well, I'm not treating my neighbor badly. I just fantasize about seducing his wife. And I think that the Bible says that's not a thought you should have. And by the way, you've got more control of your thoughts than you realize. So don't have those thoughts. They're unworthy of you. Then the New Testament, Jesus gives commands like get baptized, go to Holy Communion. And by the way, in the Epistle of James, to confess your sins to others. These are revealed commands. The last one is somewhat controversial, but these are revealed commands, and they don't spring from natural law immediately. They're not even secondary precepts of natural law. Also, love your enemies is an interesting one. Thomas Aquinas and Kant are inclined to think of two kinds of love, a love in which you work for the well-being of another, and then a love which is inspired by God. And Kant in particular wants to say a feeling cannot be commanded. You have an obligation to work for your neighbor's good, but you don't have any obligation to feel anything about it. Thomas Aquinas might disagree with Kant and say, once again, as I was saying a minute ago, you have more control over your feelings than you realize, Kant. In fact, you can begin to feel good about someone by trying to focus on how that person bears within himself or herself the image of God. Those things can happen. So we really have more control of our feelings than you. You should feel warmth and joy in the sight of another person who is a good person, exhibiting qualities that are admirable. It shouldn't just be a matter of intellectual assessment. The heart should respond to it as well. But that does imply that you have some control over what goes on in your heart or what goes on in your feelings. And that many people would deny, among them Kant.
Drawing from that, I think there is much to admire for a believer in an atheist who maybe locates his moral judgment inside of him or herself, but takes on the responsibility and the seriousness of the duty to be true to that, even though it's not ascribed to a divine command.
No, I agree. In fact, Dostoevsky was very struck with the passage in Revelation where Christ says, "You are neither hot nor cold, therefore I spit you out of my mouth." And Dostoevsky thinks that what God wants is white hot zeal, but he prefers ice cold atheism to lukewarm Christianity. It's a strong point.
So tell us more about the categorical imperative.
Yeah, sure. Happy to say something about that. I didn't give. Yeah, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say it's a very clunky phrase, categorical imperative, but I've always wanted to see a good example of that, how it's played out in real life.
I think I can give one that will be helpful. I'm sure that others can give that will be better. But so the categorical imperative says, the first version of it. The second version, the one I talked about in my presentation, was always treat rational nature, whether in yourself or in another, as an end and never as a means merely. I abbreviated that, but at Kant's encouragement, and treat persons as persons, not as things merely, with the realization sometimes we have to use others as means, again, to get to the airport if you don't have a car. But the first version of the categorical imperative is actually quite intriguing as well. And that's sometimes called the Universal Law Formulation. And what Kant says about it is you should always act on that maxim which you can will would serve as a universal law. Now, what is a maxim? I think this gets overlooked. People say, well, that's so empty. I don't know how to act on that. Well, you have maxims. And maxims are subjective principles of action. So your maxim might be, one of your maxims might be to go for a jog 3 times a week. And I might have a maxim to memorize 1 poem per month. And someone else has a maxim to try to stay in contact with his aging parents. Okay, so these are maxims. By the way, a fourth person might have as his maxim to write bad checks when he needs money. Okay, so now those are maxims, subjective principles of action. So Kant says, let's undertake a thought experiment. This is not going to happen in reality, but it can happen in our minds. What would happen if we universalized all 4 of those maxims, or each one of them, seriatim? What would that look like? Well, what would happen if everyone went for a jog 3 times a week? No, there might be some inconveniences, some crowding on jogging paths, but no contradiction would happen. There's nothing contradictory about everyone going for a jog 3 times a week. And what that maxim aimed at, let's say fitness, would be achieved by everyone going for a jog 3 times a week. And suppose everyone decided to adopt my maxim of memorize 1 poem a month. Well, there'd be a lot more poetry memorized. And what's the aim of such a maxim? To have a treasury of find things to think about when you are expressed with concentration, when you don't have books at hand, taking a walk, or you're delayed on the tarmac somewhere. You have poetry on your mind, you can go to that. The third maxim I mentioned was to keep in contact with your aging parents. If you have aging parents, if you don't, this maxim won't apply to you. What's the purpose of that? Well, to let them know how you're doing and to strengthen the filial and paternal ties and to express your love for them. Well, suppose everyone with aging parents contacted their parents. Yeah, it'd be nice. No problem there. I mean, the lines, telephone lines might be busy, but there's no intrinsic contradiction. Now let's look at the fourth maxim. Write bad checks when you want money. Well, we all need money, we think, even when we're wrong about that. What would happen if everyone wrote bad checks? If everyone wrote bad checks, then no one would take bad checks. Now, note, this is not a model of enlightened self-interest. Kant is not a fool. He's not saying, don't write bad checks because other people might do that as well. He's not saying because other people might do that as well. He's saying, don't write bad checks because you can see that you're operating according to a principle that, if universalized, could not be adopted by everybody else and still achieve its end. The end, the goal of the maxim to write bad checks is to get money that you didn't earn or that you don't have. But if everyone adopted that maxim, its end could not be achieved. That means that the maxim, because it cannot be universalized and adopted by all rational beings, is intrinsically irrational. It is at odds with practical reason. It contains a contradiction within itself, and therefore it can't be realized if adopted by everybody. And Kant is in effect saying that immorality is irrationality in action.
So in essence, is Kant saying something like, don't do an action that you wouldn't want everyone else to do all over the world as a matter of course, something like that?
It's close, but his language is a little bit different, and it might be important. He would say it's not a matter of wanting or desires in this ordinary sense of feelings. It's that don't take as a maxim something that all people could not act on, and still achieve its end. So quite apart from whether you would want other people to do this, the more fundamental things, they couldn't all do it. Yeah, everyone could write bad checks, but that would last for about a half an hour, and no one would be taking checks, and that would be the end of that. That what doesn't happen with the other maxim. Everyone memorizes a poem once a month. Everyone goes for a jog 3 times a week. Everyone aging parents tries to keep in contact with his aging parents or aging parents. Well, there's nothing weird there. But the writing bad checks, the reason that you can't make that your maxim of action is because it is in principle ununiversalizable, and reason always works with universals. That's why I mentioned earlier, it's a nice connection with the second version of the Categorical Imperative. Any reason I can give for why you, Nathan, should treat me as a person and not a thing merely, I have to recognize that it at once no different from any reason you could give for why I should treat you as a person and not a thing merely. Reason works in universals.
Yeah, thanks. We have another question from Carl. He asks, how should we speak of Aquinas as an Aristotelian? Should we see him as primarily drawing out implications of Aristotle's thought on ethics, the soul, and perhaps metaphysics that Aristotle didn't get to? Or are there major departures of Aquinas, differences with Aristotle in philosophy, ones not due to revelation?
Well, I think there are major differences, and I emphasize that more than most people. Thomas Aquinas wrote magnificent commentaries on Aristotle. They really are extraordinarily fine, word by word commentaries, sentence by sentence. And much of what Aristotle taught, Thomas is able to incorporate into his own thinking. But I don't think Aristotle has a notion of natural law. This is a Straussian point. I think Strauss is right about this. Sometimes people refer to Thomas Aquinas as Aristotle as a natural law thinker. He doesn't speak of natural law in the way that Thomas Aquinas does. So there's a real departure right there. Aristotle talks about the virtue of the will and as justice. And that's not quite the way that Aristotle does it, and not at all the way Socrates does it in the Republic that speaks of these things. Thomas Aquinas' understanding at the level of metaphysics is that God, we need a first principle, not just of motion, but of being, which he understands to be an act. And that too is a departure from Aristotle. Now, one can say, and it's true, Thomas finds in Aristotle anticipations and certainly principles that he can make use of for his own anticipations of his own teaching, but it's not fully developed in Aristotle. And many people would say it's not fully developed because Aristotle tacitly rejected what Thomas's innovations. I don't think that's exactly right, because there's no reason to think, as far as I can tell, that Aristotle considered the things that Thomas Aquinas developed in some detail. There's a famous, well-known Thomist who says that Thomas Aquinas is the greatest Aristotelian who ever lived. As impressive as that sounds, I don't think it does enough justice to Thomas. I think Thomas sees some things that Aristotle didn't see. So people say, well, that's because he's a believer. Yeah, obviously there are things that Thomas Aquinas believes that Aristotle didn't dream of. There's a famous formulation of Thomas Aquinas, as you might like, and that is that all the philosophers before the coming of Christ could not know as much as is necessary for salvation as a little old serving woman knows through her faith, because she knows what the church teaches, and Plato and Aristotle couldn't know that. But to repeat, at the level of reason, natural reason, I think that Thomas Aquinas' natural law teaching is an advance over Aristotle. And I think that his metaphysics, his distinction between being and essence, is also an advance over Aristotle and what he does with that distinction.
Let me ask again about the Kantian idea of not treating people as means. How is that altered in a world in which, or circumstances in which, you feel like the world is a zero-sum contest? If you feel like, maybe in circumstances of war, for example, if you feel like my well-being requires your unwell-being, and therefore requires me to, or maybe allows me, necessitates me to treat you as a means in these rare extreme circumstances, how does the Kantian teaching apply to those rare extreme circumstances?
Well, it's a good question, but note in combat, there are laws of war. They're actually codified. And for instance, you're not permitted to target non-combatants. You are required to take prisoners when they surrender. If the purpose was to just harm the other person, treat them as a mere means, kill all those prisoners, kill them with life. You know, you kill them, you take them behind the lines, you house them, you feed them. It's a moral obligation that you have to treat them with respect. Our troops are forbidden. They sometimes do it, but they're forbidden from mutilating corpses. So war is a sad feature of life. There's no doubt about that. Thomas Aquinas has a very rich teaching on just war principles. It's interesting, the question in which he treats the criteria that have to be filled for war to be just. The question is war always sinful? And the very question implies that it might be sinful most of the time. In fact, I think his teaching is that it's impossible for two countries to go to war on fully just grounds. You can't both justly defend your country and I justly attack.
Mm-hmm. Is it a logical fallacy, like some kind of violation of natural reason, to look at the world in zero-sum terms, in the sense that, you know, my survival necessitates your annihilation? Is that
well? So I mean, there may be occasions where the only way I can survive is to take life. Someone's hanging onto a plank in the water and the ship is sunk and I'm stronger than he is. Let's say it's a child and I go over and push him off. And that's murder. You're not compelled to do that because life is not the highest human good. The highest human good is rationality. If the only way I can keep from going to, I'll give this example. I give this example in my book. I think it's kind of vivid. Let's say that there's a tyrant and the tyrant is very unpopular and he has a popular general and he's worried about that. And he thinks that people might prefer the general to be their ruler over him. And so he decides he has to do away with the general, but he can't do that very easily because people will think if the general goes into the fog and mist, the tyrant murdered him. So he approaches you and he says, I want you to bear false witness against this general. I want you to accuse him of a crime he didn't commit because that's the only way I'm going to execute him and not bring upon myself the outrage of the citizens. And you say, well, I don't want to do that. And the tyrant says, I understand that. But if you don't, I'm going to kill you instead. And you won't be missed if you go into the fog and mist. You'll be missed, but no one will suspect that I had it done. They think some highwayman killed you. Well, what should you do? Well, you want to live. Thomas Aquinas says that the no good, including the good of life itself, is to be preferred to what he calls the good of reason. It's at odds with your rational nature. Your rational nature, which has ends of its own. It's not just an instrument to help you achieve bodily ends like health, longevity, and life itself. You have ends of consistency, and it would be an egregious violation of the natural law to bear false witness against an innocent human being, even to save your own life. And someone could say, okay, but Jim, suppose the only way you can keep some killer from cutting your child's throat is if you cut your neighbor's child's throat. What you going to do then? Well, I don't know what I'd do then, but I hope I would say no. Being moral isn't for sissies. It comes with a price.
Yeah, some of the great expressions of conscience are not only about some kind of moral stand, but it's also about like a decision based on reason, right? Like some of the great, someone like, I don't know, Bonhoeffer of Germany, or someone like Socrates or Jesus even, the world history is full of people of conscience. Thomas More, for example, they're operating on reason and morality, right?
Well, that's, you can put it that way, but what I'm trying to argue is that morality has a rational core. It's not so much reason and morality, it's reason, practical reason functioning in the moral sphere according to principles.
Does anyone else have any more questions? Feel free to submit them. I have a question to ask. Can a person be moral without being a thinking person? A philosophical person?
Oh, yes, absolutely. No, in fact, Kant thinks that it's philosophical people who are more likely to think badly when they engage in moral matters. He thinks that the average well-brought-up farm boy probably has a more refined moral sense than the average college professor. And why is that? Because the latter has so many other extraneous things entering in his mind, thinking about duty, that he gets confused about what he ought to do. Because he says, well, these moral principles are just matters of societal conditioning. Right? Actually, you got these things going in your brain that cause your nerves to move, and you can't help but do what you do. There's no such thing as free will. I remember when I was in college during the Vietnam War and hearing a psychology professor in a lecture telling us that we don't really have any choice over what we do. It's all just conditioning. It's a environment. It's these forces that we're little machines that we sort of propel forward. There's no free choice. There are no real obligations. Then outside of class, shouting about how Nixon was an evil war criminal and how dare he do what he did in Cambodia and so forth, as though morality matters. The average well-brought-up farm boy is not confused in the way that the college professor is likely to be.
And where does that confusion come in?
Well, it's partly from behavioral psychology. Everyone's after his cookies. That's what I was told when I first started teaching in elementary school. Everyone's after his cookies. So it's just a matter of pleasure seeking, no principles. If there are no principles, then just some people get wrong what their pleasure is. How can people be morally outraged? And yet they all are, philosophers included, philosophy teachers included. Nietzsche didn't want to be morally outraged. He wanted to replace thou shalt or I ought with I will. But he had the consistency to see that was too much for him. He gets outraged too. But outrage assumes that there's freedom. How in the world could I get angry with you for doing something that you couldn't help but do? That's why, as a colleague of mine once pointed out, it's a very important observation. Socrates is never presented as outraged or even angry, certainly not indignant. Because if Socrates doesn't think there's free choice, that's a big F, by the way, but if Socrates doesn't think there's free choice, then he knows that the rational way for him to react to the things around him is with equanimity and never with indignation, outrage, or even anger.
So would both Kant and Aquinas say there's always choice in the moral?
They would put it carefully. To make a case for morality, you don't have to say that everything we do is a matter of free choice, but at least one thing we do is a matter of free choice. In fact, in Kant's metaphysics of the will, it's very curious. He seems to think that there's one free act that you make outside of time in the noumenal realm for Kant, which affects your whole temporal phenomenal existence. That's not the way Thomas Aquinas argues, but I don't think either person would say everything that you do with free choice. Maybe a lot of things we do, we're necessitated by certain things going on, but we can usually check ourselves. So let's say if it's a matter of habit that every morning I get up and put on my watch, and someone were to say to me, this morning, if you put your watch on, that will lead to the death of an innocent human being somewhere else, I could refrain from putting on my watch, so it's a matter of habit. But my point here is that all Thomas Aquinas and Kant need for their moral theory is that that free choice be a possibility for human beings. In fact, Kant doesn't think he can prove that we're free. Thomas Aquinas seems to think he can. Here I'm closer to Kant. But Kant says, in not knowing whether we're free or not, he thinks that's beyond our ability. We cannot know whether we're free or not. But in that ignorance, how ought we to act? As though we're free or as though we're not? And he says there, the categorical imperative is unambiguous. Act as though you're free. Act as though you're responsible for your choices. Oh, but I really might not be. You'll never know.
Well, let's end there. Let's conclude our discussion, unless you have any closing remarks.
No, this is fine. I've enjoyed this very much. And I do email. If anyone wants to send me a question, I'll try to respond when I have time.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is how moral deliberation, ethical thinking, it's both really simple and really complex at the same time as it's played out in real life. Betsy, one of our viewers, says, thank you for this wonderful discussion. Very fascinating.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it and found it interesting.
But, it never plays out in a way that where we can relax our guard. We always have to be on our toes, so to speak, when we navigate through life, it seems to me. And these two philosophers seem to confirm that.
Well, I agree with you. And I will say one thing. This is not my experience, but it's interesting. I had a teacher in graduate school. He's actually rather well known, Hans Jonas. And Jonas was a Jew who left Germany when things started to go to hell there, vowing, he said, never to return except as a member of a conquering army, which he did. And Jonas said when he went back, he said there were a lot of people I really couldn't see. They'd compromised themselves. One person he did seek out, as I recall, Jonas said, a man named Julius Ebbinghaus. And Ebbinghaus had been a professor that Jonas knew about. And he did some specialized work on Kant. And he told Jonas, the only way I could keep my sanity in those years was by always keeping the second version of the categorical imperative before my mind. Am I treating this person as a mere thing, or am I treating this person as an end? Yeah, so it is, we're dual beings. We have an animal nature, and our animal nature makes certain claims, and it's understandable. Our animal nature says, don't die. Whatever you do, don't die. And don't feel pain even if you can avoid pain either if you can avoid it. And try to live a long time. Our rational nature says, be consistent. Recognize what the dignity of reason is, and recognize that it's present, even if it's not vividly manifest in all people who can speak.
Well, so Dan says, thanks, Mr. Carey, and thanks, Nathan, for hosting. Very interesting discussion.
Good.
I do believe Dan is also a graduate of St. John's College. So thanks, Dan, for coming. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Jim, thank you very much for giving your time to us. And,
My great pleasure.
Enlightening us. Carl says, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Nathan. This was great. So thanks, everyone. And we will hope to see you next time.